The world has always seen Jim Carrey as a storm of electric energy, a man who could twist his face, reshape his voice, and bend his entire body into living madness. He didn't just act, he exploded onto every screen he touched, every wild grin, every manic gesture, every moment where he threw his entire soul into comedy. They were all pieces of a shimmering mask that dazzled millions. But behind that mask lived a man walking a razor-thin line, suspended between exhilaration and exhaustion, between roaring laughter and crushing silence. While the world celebrated him as an unstoppable force of joy, Jim Carrey wrestled with shadows that fame could never erase: the weight of depression, the fragility of identity, and the overwhelming demand to always be Jim Carrey, the man who could make everyone else feel better, even when he couldn't do the same for himself. For someone whose life unfolded beneath blinding spotlights, the quiet moments backstage held the deepest loneliness. How does a man who makes the world laugh confront the nights when the laughter dies? How does someone who embodies joy find the strength to face despair when no one is watching? This story begins where the applause fades, where the man behind the mask finally steps into the light. Jim Carrey was not born into comfort, nor into the glittering world he would one day command. He entered life on January 17th, 1962, in Newmarket, Ontario, a place where dreams were fragile and a survival was a daily negotiation. His father, Percy Carey, was a man of immense talent, a musician at heart, and an accountant by necessity. Yet the stability his family needed slipped through his fingers again and again. Jobs came and went, bills piled up, and the quiet dread of not knowing tomorrow seeped into every corner of their small home. His mother, Kathleen, fought to keep the family's spirit intact, even while battling her own storms. She held the household together with tenderness, humor, and resilience that shaped Jim more than he ever admitted. In that fragile home, laughter wasn't entertainment, it was survival, a protective shield, a way to keep fear from swallowing them whole. From the time he could walk and talk, Jim discovered that he could change the atmosphere of an entire room with nothing more than a silly face, an exaggerated voice, or a perfectly timed mimicry. And in a world where money was scarce and hope was thin, that talent felt like magic. At school, he became the kid who could imitate teachers flawlessly, who could keep classmates mesmerized with impressions and jokes. But these performances weren't just for fun. They were a rebellion against heaviness, a way to carve out moments of control when everything else felt uncertain. By age 12, Jim was stepping onto small local stages, performing at talent shows. The applause was modest, but to him, it was oxygen. It was the first confirmation that the world had a place for him, even if that place wasn't within the walls of his struggling home. Yet behind his budding gift, the reality was harsh. The Carey family's financial troubles deepened. There were nights when the lights dimmed because bills went unpaid. Meals were stretched in ways children never fully understand but always feel. Those hardships etched themselves into Jim's personality, shaping the frantic joy he would later project to the world. Humor became his armor, performance became his escape, and every exaggerated expression hid a child learning to survive in a world that could collapse at any moment. As Jim Carrey stepped into his teenage years, the stage became more than a place to entertain. It became a sanctuary, a refuge from eviction notices, From the tense silence that followed every bill his parents couldn't pay, from the unspoken fear that tomorrow might be worse than today. He wasn't just performing anymore, he was crafting himself. He wrote his own routines with the precision of someone far older than his age. He experimented with timing, with impressions, with the strange elastic power of his face. Every community hall, every school gathering, every modest gig was another stepping stone, another lesson in turning pain into laughter. And the applause, it wasn't just validation, it was survival. It was proof that the boy who lived in uncertainty could create certainty for others, even just for a moment. Yet the duality that would define his entire life was already forming. People laughed with him, but he was laughing through something. His jokes carried the weight of unspoken fears. His wild expressions masked a vulnerability he never dared reveal. By the late 1970s, Jim stepped into Toronto's stand-up comedy scene, a place vibrant with ambition but merciless with rejection. These early performances were grueling, often thankless. Small clubs, smaller paychecks, exhausting nights that bled into uncertain mornings, but each set sharpened him. He learned how to read an audience, how to bend silence to his will, how to turn insecurity into energy. He discovered that laughter wasn't merely a sound, it was a doorway, a connection, a bridge between himself and a world he desperately wanted to understand. Still, beneath every performance was a layer of quiet pain, because comedy, while powerful, was never enough to erase the scars of his upbringing. It soothed, it healed, but it didn't erase. And that complexity, that blend of brilliance and fragility, would follow him all the way to Hollywood. By the early 1980s, Jim Carrey stood at a crossroads. Toronto had shaped him, tested him, sharpened his comedic instincts, but he knew his destiny demanded a bigger stage, a terrifying stage where countless dreamers had arrived before him and vanished without a trace. He packed a suitcase full of hope, a notebook overflowing with impressions, and boarded a bus to Los Angeles, the city where dreams are made, broken, and remade again. Los Angeles did not welcome him with red carpets. It greeted him with a struggle. He performed in tiny clubs, sometimes to crowds that barely looked up. He auditioned endlessly, often leaving rooms where casting directors barely remembered his name. He lived paycheck to paycheck, always one bad month away from returning home defeated. But Jim Carrey was not built for surrender. His appearances on shows like The Tonight Show were small, flashes of promise, hints of recognition. Yet every brief moment in the spotlight only fueled his determination. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing validation, chasing the feeling he tasted as a child, the moment when laughter washed away fear. Television variety shows, late-night appearances, endless writing sessions. They became the grindstone that sharpened his craft. He studied rhythm, refined characters, perfected the delicate music of comedy timing, and slowly, painfully, opportunities grew. Comedy, once his shield as a boy, became his passport in Hollywood. With every step forward, he carried the same lesson he learned in childhood. If life was unstable, then laughter could be his anchor. If the world was unpredictable, then humor could be his language. By the early 1990s, the industry could no longer ignore him. Hollywood had auditioned the young Canadian countless times, and now, finally, it was calling him back, and everything was about to change. The early 1990s marked a turning point not just in Jim Carrey's career, but in the entire landscape of comedy. When he burst onto the big screen in Ace Ventura, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber, audiences were left stunned. It wasn't just comedy, it wasn't just performance, it was something new. A kind of elastic, explosive, unrestrained artistry the world had never seen before. Jim didn't play characters, he became them. His body twisted like animated rubber. His face transformed into shapes that seemed physically impossible. His timing was surgical, his energy was volcanic, and moviegoers couldn't get enough. The box office numbers were staggering. His films didn't just succeed, they dominated. Millions flocked to theaters, not just to watch a movie, but to experience Jim Carrey. In a matter of a few years, he became one of Hollywood's most bankable stars, a performer whose name alone could guarantee a global hit. Studios competed for him. Contracts soared into the tens of millions. Critics debated his genius. Fans memorized every catchphrase, every expression, every moment of manic brilliance. He became the face of a generation's humor, a cultural force, a phenomenon. But success, as dazzling as it was, came with the hidden cost. Behind the public triumphs, Jim's private life grew increasingly complicated. Fame brought a scrutiny, a constant, inescapable lens, where even his quietest moments were magnified. The relentless touring, interviews, and promotional demands drained him emotionally. Every smile for the cameras was another brick added to the mask he had been wearing since childhood. People adored the hyperactive, unpredictable Jim Carrey, but few understood the exhaustion that lived beneath that persona. Friends noticed the moments when he withdrew, periods when the laughter stopped, replaced by stillness, reflection, and a heaviness he could not disguise. His success felt both like a gift and a cage, a dazzling world that demanded perpetual performance. For the world, he was invincible, but inside, he was beginning to crack. Even as Jim Carrey's star reached unimaginable heights, a quiet storm was unfolding behind the curtain. To millions, he was the embodiment of unshakable joy, the man who could ignite a room with a single expression. But inside, he carried a weight that grew heavier with every passing year. Depression, a word whispered, not spoken, a companion he never invited, yet one that never left his side. The intensity that electrified his performances came from a deep emotional well, one that often bordered on darkness. The same boundless energy that made him iconic on a screen drained him in private. When the cameras stopped rolling, silence felt deafening, empty, heavy. Jim searched desperately for understanding. He explored therapy, he practiced meditation, he read the spiritual texts, questioned identity, and began dissecting the architecture of his own mind. He poured emotions onto paper, into sketchbooks, across canvases, transforming internal chaos into tangible art. For Jim, creativity became survival. He didn't just paint, he bled onto the canvas. He didn't just write, he released everything he could not say out loud. And depression influenced his choices as an artist in ways the world rarely noticed. He began taking roles that mirrored his inner questions. Films like The Truman Show, where reality, identity, and emotional truth collided. These performances were not just acting, they were reflections, windows into a man wrestling with himself. Yet Jim refused to drown in silence. Instead, he made a choice few public figures dared to make at the time. He spoke openly about mental health, without sensationalism, without shame. He reminded people that emotional suffering does not discriminate, that even those who make the world laugh can feel broken inside. that vulnerability is not weakness, but humanity. His honesty gave thousands, perhaps millions, permission to confront their own struggles, to know they weren't alone, to know that even the brightest laughter can hide the deepest pain. Through art, reflection, and resilience, Jim navigated the darkest corners of his life, and slowly the public began to see not just the performer, but the man beneath the mask. As the roar of fame began to quiet, something unexpected happened. Jim Carrey, the man who once lived in motion, intensity, and constant transformation, discovered a new language, a quieter one, a slower one, a language painted in color instead of spoken in jokes, art. Not the art of performance, but the art of presence. His studio became a sanctuary, a peaceful, sunlit world far removed from Hollywood's demands. Giant canvases leaned against every wall. Colors exploded across the room like emotional fingerprints. Brush strokes carried the tenderness, confusion, grief, and hope he had never fully expressed in words. In interviews, Jim described it simply: I needed color. Through painting, he confronted pieces of himself long hidden behind characters and comedy. Faces emerged with haunting eyes. Landscapes carried echoes of memory. Abstract shapes pulsed with raw emotion. Critics were surprised. Galleries in Los Angeles and Las Vegas featured his work, calling it fearless, honest, and emotionally unfiltered. What audiences once saw only in his smile, his expression, his comedic chaos, now revealed itself in quiet strokes of blue, red, yellow, and black. But painting wasn't just an artistic shift, it was healing. The stillness required him to sit with his emotions rather than escape them. The act of creating became a form of meditation, a conversation between his heart and the canvas. Photography followed. His lens captured imperfection, tenderness, the human spirit stripped bare. He found beauty in small moments, the same way he once found humor in the ordinary. Art did not replace comedy, it expanded it. The boy who once performed to survive hardship, the man who entertained the world to mask his own darkness, had now found a way to express truth without needing to perform at all. Through painting and photography, Jim Carrey revealed not just skill, but a soul in transition, a man shifting from chaos to contemplation, from loudness to clarity, from performance to peace. Time has a way of reshaping even the brightest legends, softening their edges and clarifying what truly matters. For Jim Carrey, the later chapters of his life were not defined by fading away, but by rediscovery. The man who once commanded box offices with raw, unrestrained energy began embracing something entirely different: stillness. Not the stillness of giving up, but the stillness of awakening. He no longer chased applause. He no longer sought the validation that had once felt like oxygen. Instead, he turned inward, toward meaning, balance, and the fragile but profound art of simply being human. His legacy in film and comedy was already secured. He had influenced an entire generation, reinvented physical comedy, and created characters etched permanently into pop culture. But Jim began speaking publicly in a new tone, calmer, reflective, deeply honest. He talked about aging not as decline, but as clarity. He talked about creativity not as performance, but as expression. He talked about health, not just physical, but emotional, the need to tend the mind with the same care one gives to the body. He learned that success, while dazzling, is temporary, but understanding oneself is eternal. His later roles reflected this maturity, quieter characters layered with introspection, depth, and the weight of lived experience. He no longer needed to twist his face or bend his voice to prove himself. His truth was powerful enough. Off-screen, his art continued to evolve. Brush strokes became bolder, themes became richer. Every piece carried the echo of lessons earned through decades of heartbreak, triumph, and transformation. Jim no longer sought perfection in life or art. He sought truth, presence, freedom from the expectations that once chained him to the persona the world demanded. In interviews, he spoke about mindfulness, simplicity, and letting go, about learning to slow down after a lifetime of being pushed forward by fame's relentless current. He embraced the idea that fulfillment is not found in noise, but in acceptance, not in applause, but in awareness. His openness about mental health became a beacon. Artists, fans, and younger performers looked to him for courage, for proof that vulnerability is not the opposite of a strength. It is strength. Jim Carrey, once the king of chaos, had become a teacher in calm. His influence expanded beyond entertainment into something deeper, a symbol of resilience, reinvention, and emotional honesty. He showed that evolution is not abandoning who you were, but growing into who you were always meant to become. His story, woven with light and shadows, triumphs and scars, performance and stillness, stands as a testament to what it means to be profoundly human. As Jim Carrey entered his 60s, the world expected him to continue shining, continue acting, continue being the man who lit up screens for decades. But for the first time in his life, Jim chose to step back, not out of defeat, but out of clarity. He began to speak openly about retirement, about slowing down, about letting go of the identity the world had built around him, and then came the revelation that shook fans everywhere. Jim Carrey, at 63, was preparing to say goodbye, withdrawing from the relentless world of Hollywood after facing a serious, life-altering diagnosis that forced him to look inward more deeply than ever before. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it wasn't wrapped in the manic energy people once associated with him. It was gentle, honest, and profoundly human. He explained that he had lived a full life, one filled with creativity, chaos, joy, heartbreak, reinvention, and transformation. But now he felt called toward peace, spirituality, and the simple act of living quietly. He no longer needed cameras. He no longer needed fame. He no longer needed the world to watch him in order to exist. His home became a retreat, filled with canvases, sketches, soft music, and the presence of nature. He spoke about wanting to spend his remaining years creating art, writing, healing, and giving attention to the parts of life fame had once overshadowed. Jim acknowledged that life is fragile, that health is something we cannot bargain with, and that the body, after decades of stress, transformation, and emotional weight, eventually demands gentleness. He didn't leave Hollywood bitter. He left it grateful, grateful for the applause, grateful for the laughter, grateful for the chaos that shaped him, the pain that taught him, and the art that saved him. In one interview, he said, "I've done enough. I am enough." Simple words, yet words that carried the weight of a lifetime. For a man who once needed the world to see him, he had finally learned how to see himself. The goodbye wasn't the end of a story. It was the closing of one chapter and the peaceful opening of another. A chapter where Jim Carrey no longer performs for the world, but finally, beautifully lives for himself. Jim Carrey's story is not a tale of rise and fall. It is a story of becoming, of peeling back the layers of identity shaped by hardship, fame, pain, and creativity. A journey from chaos to clarity, from performance to peace. The boy who once used humor to protect his fragile family. The young man who fought his way through dingy comedy clubs. The superstar who redefined what physical comedy could be. The artist who turned inward to heal wounds the world never saw. All of them were Jim Carrey. All of them shaped the man the world knows today. His legacy goes far beyond the characters that made us laugh until we cried. It is found in his courage to confront depression, in his honesty about mental health, in his willingness to show the world that behind even the brightest smile, there can be darkness, and that speaking about it is not weakness, but strength. He taught us that creativity is not just an act of entertainment, but an act of survival, a way to process pain, trauma, and longing, a bridge between the inner world and the outer one. His paintings, filled with bold vulnerability, reflect a soul continually searching for truth. His interviews, stripped of Hollywood glamour, reveal a man who has embraced authenticity over applause. And his final years, spent in quiet reflection, remind us that it is never too late to rewrite the meaning of life. Jim Carrey's greatest accomplishment was never the box office numbers, the awards, or the global fame. His greatest accomplishment was the courage to transform, to grow, to confront himself, to choose peace over pressure, to choose healing over performance. He showed the world that even legends are human, that laughter can coexist with pain, that reinvention is possible at any age, and that true success is not found in the spotlight, but in the quiet acceptance of one's own heart. As Jim Carrey steps away from Hollywood and into a gentler chapter of life, he leaves behind more than a filmography. He leaves a reminder that behind every mask, every performance, every burst of laughter, there is a story, a struggle, a soul, and sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is finally let the world see the truth behind the smile.